live. All right. So it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this seminar on Towards Geoeconomics 2.0. I had a few notes here, but I can't get them up and running. Let's see. Scribble something down. Anyway, my name is Mikael Vigel. I'm the research director here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. It's my pleasure indeed to welcome everybody to this seminar. We're doing it in 2 sessions. First, an hour of talk here about very topical issues around geoeconomics, and then we have a break in between, and we continue with a book launch after the break for an hour and a half or so. FIA, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, here we've been doing, at FIA we've been doing geoeconomic research for more than 10 years. It's a priority research theme for us, very much a horizontal theme, cutting across all our research programs, because we very much see geoeconomics as a strategic practice, which is becoming a key feature of the emerging international order, with major ramifications for not only states, but also non-state actors, including business. And most research so far has concerned geoeconomic statecraft, statist geoeconomic strategies, and power politics, but it is becoming increasingly clear that also non-state actors, particularly corporations, have geoeconomic agency of their own. Corporations are not only takers, but also shapers of the new geoeconomic order, if we wish to call it that. So there's a sort of a struggle for geoeconomic power and autonomy, not only between states, but also increasingly between states and corporations. And it's radically changing the operating environment, the world economy, the global economy. And that's increasingly also what our research at FIA is focusing on and what we'll be talking and discussing here today. And before letting Cordelia take over, I'm also very happy to announce that we yesterday got a decision from the Academy of Finland that it will be funding our very, very ambitious multi-year geoeconomic research initiative around the topic of geoeconomics 2.0 that will allow us to do some really new and innovative and fun stuff. And the review of the project used the words high risk, high reward to characterize our new project, and so it's an exciting endeavor that we're embarking on. And with that, I will yield the floor to Cordelia Buchanan-Ponchik, visiting researcher at FIA and doctoral candidate at Oxford, and who will also be very much involved in the JERI project, which I'm really happy and looking forward to.
Great, thank you so much, Mikael. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, both to the in-person and, of course, the online audience. As Mikael said, we have a great panel ahead of us with a lot of interesting people, good discussion to get through, and I'm pretty excited for that. So just to give you an idea of how the panel is going to work, we're going to give our speakers some time to present their ideas. Then we'll have Q&A, a bit that will be led by me, and a bit that will be led by the audience when it's time. So let's get started and introduce our panelists. Immediately to my side, we have Tobias, who's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he's leading their geoeconomic work. Tobias has just earned his PhD in geoeconomics, where he wrote about how great power competition is transforming the global economy. And now he's contributing to the policy debate on how Europe needs to position itself in this transformation. Next up, we have Ashley, who is a professor of practice of international affairs at Georgetown. Ashley moves between finance, academia, and policy. Over the last 20 years, she has covered the interface between political economy and security, with a focus on investment screening measures as a form of balancing. Then we have Jens, who writes and lectures at the intersection of law and geoeconomics. He is an experienced attorney who has practiced in New York and at the European Stability Mechanism. After completing his LLM at Harvard Law School, Jens pursued PhD degrees, plural, in law and political science, and he's an incoming researcher at FIA and will be part of the project that Mikhail just mentioned. And Mikhail, we know. So, Tobias, go ahead and set us off.
Thanks so much, Cordelia, and thanks so much, Mika, for bringing me to Helsinki. The context of this was that I defended my PhD late last year, and Jens approached me and he said, "Oh, it would be great to have a book talk about your PhD." And he said, "Well, it's going to be a fireside chat, 1 hour, one-on-one, the two of us." I thought, brilliant, right? Because whenever I pitched this idea to my girlfriend, she conspicuously fell asleep. So I thought it was a great start, but now it has morphed into something much bigger, where we brought this great panel together. But instead of 1 hour, I was only given 8 minutes to pitch my PhD, so it's going to be quite tight. Jens also instructed me to be very fiery and interesting. So it's an impossible task, really, in 8 minutes, but I'm going to give it a try, and just going to focus on the 3 elements of how I made sense of geoeconomics in my PhD. So for me, it was sort of 3 elements of geoeconomics. The first one is that geoeconomics to me really is it's a set of ideas and principles that policymakers sort of adapt. There's 2 elements to this. One is that this idea that states, my state, if I'm a policymaker, is in the state of great power competition over controlling key elements, strategic assets in the global economy. Technology, infrastructure, data, raw materials, these kind of things. And that there's this great power competition over who really controls or who has access to these elements. The second element of this set of ideas is one of vulnerability, this growing sense or idea that economic integration has more and more vulnerabilities rather than benefits. And these ideas, they translate into a certain narrative. That's a geoeconomic narrative, I would say. And you can see that growing dramatically in the last couple of years, but even today, right? Great examples is Jake Sullivan gave a couple of speeches, one just a couple of weeks ago at Brookings Institution, setting out a new Washington consensus. And it's filled with this idea that globalization, economic strategy of the United States must change because there's certain vulnerabilities, there's certain competition for controlling technologies and so on. But also in China, Xi Jinping, when he speaks about this competition, he says China must hold in its own hands core technologies, he says, right? He also says that China's incredibly vulnerable, that dependencies on America is like building your house, your card house on sort of rocks or something like this. I can't remember exactly, but so they speak very much in these narratives of vulnerability and competition for control. Also, by the way, in India has these ideas quite similar to China of being self-reliant, that it needs to address vulnerabilities and foreign dependencies. And of course, the European debate, we all know, strategic autonomy. It's all about vulnerability. It's really a sort of narrative element that's quite powerful. So that's the first element, the first level of narrative. And then I would say narratives really, really matter, right? We don't just talk about them, they matter. They translate eventually into policy. And that's sort of my second level, geoeconomic policies. And in my thesis, I tried to sort of make sense of them, how we can categorize them. There's, for me, sort of two dimensions. There's the protective policies, trying to protect the assets I already have, investment screening, export controls. There's promotive element, trying to win those strategic assets that I haven't yet won. Industrial policy to win emerging technologies, for example. So we can classify these. We can classify also inward-looking policies. Industrial policy is national policy, or outward-looking policies, like trying to influence international standardization, international raw material agreements, for example. So we can make this cluster, and we can fill in all sorts of economic policies, I think, into this cluster. But then the big question is, of course, what makes them really geoeconomic policies? To me, any policy, any economic policy can be geoeconomic. What matters really is the motivation behind the policy. Policies that are inherently framed in this narrative about a competition for control and this vulnerability aspect, That's what makes them really geoeconomic in my world, right? So export controls, there's a very narrow case where export controls target really specific items that are important for military use. But then export controls have also morphed into something that is about competition for technological leadership, right? And that what makes them, to me, geoeconomic, this idea that policymakers adopt this competition. So these are the sort of policy elements. Then the third level, the final one, maybe most importantly, is for me that the system level. So geoeconomics has a tendency to be what I call a geoeconomic dynamic. And what I mean by that, it works a bit like, so one state adopts geoeconomic measures, export controls, sanctions against another state. That has an incredible impact on another state, on that idea that, well, I'm vulnerable and I need to also do the same thing. It's sort of the security dilemma from IR a little bit, right? Just in the economic world. And there's really great examples where this is very visible. The best one, I think, in recent history at least, is the Huawei case. The American government under Trump, 2018, 2019, really targeted Huawei, a national tech champion of China, of course, with a bunch of geoeconomic measures, sanctions, export controls, and other restrictions. And that really had an incredible impact on the narrative and the framing in China, right? Those people in the Chinese government and leadership who've been saying all along that China is vulnerable, they were really strengthened in their case. And they really could make the case that China has to really double down on now making sure that it decreases these vulnerabilities. So China responded by really doubling down on its industrial policy, by shielding much more its tech champions. And so that measure, again, had, of course, an impact on the debate in the United States, but also in Europe. European policymakers saw that China is doubling down on its non-market practices and industrial policy and so on, and sort of it fueled our sort of geoeconomic narrative and then also our policies, right? So there's this, that makes sense. There's this circle, there's this dynamic, and that's, I think, quite powerful and important to understand, and that's why I say it's transforming the global economy, because it really is, because we're in this sort of systemic dynamic. That's the bottom line of these three elements. So let me leave it here and kick off to you. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Tobias. Now we'll move on to Ashley.
Hello, everyone. It is working. And thank you also for having me here today. So I came into this space about 20 years ago, looking at interventions into foreign investments in a variety of capacities, whether using investment screening mechanisms or other forms of regulations on national security grounds. So I wrote a book on this a couple of years ago where I argued that that specific behavior could be understood within the wider context of the balance of power. So in international relations theory, we realists tend to argue that states will balance powers either externally through forming external alliances militarily, or internally balance by building up both their economy and their military power through other means. And so basically, I have argued over the years that states, of course, use foreign investment and other tools in the economic sphere as forms of economic statecraft to increase their power relative to other states. That behavior is strategic, but it is also about more than just military power. It is also about economic power. And sometimes states make investments for other means of surrounding power as well, including soft power and other forms of influence. Now, the flip side of that coin, and the one that I focused on in the book, which is less important here, but is that states then use their right to regulate, to mitigate foreign investments, to block them in order to defend themselves and preserve their own relative power. So I argue that that's a form of internal balancing. It's non-military internal balancing because it takes place in the economic sphere, but it's not always just about balancing economically. It can be about balancing military capabilities. It can be about balancing soft power. And the nice thing about that type of balancing, and the thing that is interesting here, is that it can allow states to actually maximize their position versus other states without necessarily engaging in competitive and adversarial discourse. But states can also overbalance in the economic sphere. And I think that that's lesson is important for what we're discussing today. So in my current work, what we are trying to do at the moment is to actually expand this theory by looking at the many ways in the geoeconomic sphere that states both balance and buck pass, how they bandwagon with each other, how they cooperate. So balancing behaviors might be foreign investment screening, they could be imposing multilateral or unilateral sanctions, or they could be promoting competitiveness or innovation in different ways. Bandwagoning behavior cooperations could be cooperation on economic supply chains and resiliency, and it could be bilateral trade and investment treaties. Could take a lot of forms, but we're trying to understand basically the different ways in the economic sphere that states can both engage in this behavior, but can also engage in things like buck passing, burden sharing, and how they can work together, not just adversarial. So I take a much longer lens, longer view of history in the geoeconomic sphere. I think a lot of what we're going to focus on today is kind of the 90s forward. But I really see these patterns of behavior throughout history, right? From the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides, all the way through to how we understand the interactions of political power and economic power during the Middle Ages, whether it was through the salt trade or the silk trade, through to the Age of Empire with the behavior of the Dutch East India Company, which at that time held truly radical power, not too different from the corporate geoeconomics that you will be talking about soon. And even the patterns of discourse that we've seen kind of ebb and flow over time. So I think what we're really trying to understand here with the future of geoeconomics is, both to recognize that there's a cyclical and enduring nature of these patterns of behavior, but that there is something different about what's happening today, right? There is something a little bit different that has changed. Part of that is discourse-oriented, but part of it, like other patterns in history where you've seen a flattening between the political and economic space, really revolves around technology and how technology has changed the way we define national security, but also the relationship that has developed between, the close relationship between not just aerospace and defense companies and states, but also between the markets and states. And that's a little bit harder to control and something that I'd love to talk about in the discussion. One of the things that we were asked to do today was to talk a little bit as well about Tobias's work, which I really like and really enjoy, and I think we share a lot of the same views. But one of the things that I would constructively suggest for when you turn it into a book is to widen out the focus a little bit beyond US, China, and Europe. Because I think that you're going to see this pattern much more widely and these behaviors much more widely beyond that narrow frame of current competition in this space. We all know that Europe is not a coherent actor either, and that also poses some challenges for the ability of the European Commission to actually wield tools of geoeconomic power, right? Because they might want to do certain things like outbound investment screening mechanisms. That might be very difficult as an actor that is not fully unitary. The other thing that I'd bring in is regional geoeconomic competition. So not just between adversaries, but within alliances itself. I mean, we know that there is this behavior within the European Union itself, right? Among different states. And that's always important to remember as we try and understand and kind of theorizing when we're more likely to see certain things happen, right? We can never predict, but we can always try to hope to understand patterns of behavior. And then I know I've got 30 seconds left. So my last comment is to not forget within this discourse what I would call geoeconomic powers that don't have a high GDP, right? Those choke point powers that have military positioning, alliance relationships, key strategic positioning, and some key economic resources and industries that we can't forget. So whether that's Japan or Taiwan, when it comes to semiconductors, or Australia, they're really an important part of this conversation, and I think sometimes get lost in it. So
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. And that already begins to raise some points that I think our audience will be picking up on for their Q&A, but also that I think Jens and Mikael will speak to when you're talking about widening this lens and the different actors that will be brought into this space. So Jens, go ahead.
Thank you, Cordelia. I have a few slides that I will display. So the title we gave today's seminar is Geoeconomics 2.0. And let me offer my interpretation of what that means. So in a nutshell, it's about a tipping point at which private interests will eclipse public interests as the engine of geoeconomic transformation, according to the principle that profit follows power. So today, geoeconomics is generally held, as we heard, to be equated with state power projection by economic means. Yet, as we also heard from Tobias, in the West, critical sectors of the economy, critical infrastructure, whether it's virtual or physical, critical technologies, supply of critical inputs like raw materials, data, media, are privately owned and controlled to a very large extent. So what states do is that they mobilize and they harness these critical sectors as capabilities and defend them as vulnerabilities. Through instruments such as industrial policy, states mobilize crucial sectors of the economy as capabilities. And states promote economic security and resilience in critical sectors, for example, through inbound investment screening, subsidies controls, and such. And they project economic power through economic sanctions to deny access to such capabilities, for example, bans on accessing critical financial infrastructure like SWIFT, or through outbound investment screening or export controls to deny access to critical technologies or inputs, or data protection and bans on international data transfer. In all these examples, in all these cases, business is being mobilized and made to address vulnerabilities. In short, businesses are made to carry the compliance burden. Now, this modus operandi is assumed to conflict with inherent motivations of private enterprise. Businesses are assumed to follow a market capitalist logic. Businesses are assumed to push for fair and transparent rules of market access, such as relying on laws and international treaties, for example, bilateral investment treaties, or international institutions, such as the WTO, rather than privileged treatment or privileged market access through private-public contracts, such as investor-state contracts or sovereign finance. In short, businesses are assumed to behave as they should behave, at least according to economics textbooks. This is, ladies and gentlemen, wrong. It is a common mistake to assume that business strategy is principles-based. In fact, the opposite is true. Business strategy is inherently opportunity-based. In our forthcoming research, Mikael and I are theorizing how sustained geoeconomic power competition is modifying the international political economy of business strategy. And we are reimagining private enterprise in an age of geoeconomics. Using process tracing, we are mapping the pathways through which businesses adapt to and contest state geoeconomic behaviors. Yes, you can talk to businesses. Businesses are no strangers to public and government relations. You can talk to business associations or industry confederation. But businesses are not trade unionists. There is no guarantee that you will better understand business strategy that way compared to observing empirically what businesses do compared to what they say. They may talk up market capitalism, but behave in line with what we call strategic capitalism. In our research, we build a novel conceptual lens to integrate corporate geoeconomics into traditional IPE theories, and in so doing, we test our hypothesis that profit follows power. Business adapts to geoeconomics and begin to think geoeconomically in the sense of being cognizant of their geoeconomic significance to the state. And when this happens, geoeconomics becomes business-driven. And we can truly talk about corporate economic statecraft. Now, this development proceeds in two steps. First, businesses begin to compete on their ability to comply effectively and efficiently with government-led geoeconomics through two mechanisms. Compliance becomes a profit center. There are winners and there are losers. The burden of compliance varies by sector and by individual enterprise. And individual businesses are also differently affected by geoeconomic instruments. Some businesses are simply better at running an efficient compliance function than other businesses. And we see that, for example, when it comes to economic resilience. Over time, compliance inefficient firms retreat, disappear, become unprofitable. They merge, they divest, they transfer assets, they go out of business. They leave the prevailing competitor businesses with increased market power in a captive market. In the second phase, businesses begin to think geoeconomically. They begin to follow the logic of corporate geostrategy and truly assume geoeconomic agency. Businesses begin to reduce geoeconomic vulnerabilities, boost their resilience, and preserve, develop, and ultimately project geoeconomic capabilities for their own benefit, for the benefit of their ultimate beneficial owners, rather than simply as an instrument of state policy. And when this happens, businesses begin to vie for structural power that will position them for geoeconomic rent-seeking. So that basically wraps it up. So if you're interested and would like to know more, please stay tuned for further updates from our new research team, Cordelia, Mikael, myself, some others as well, which, as we heard, just received generous funding from the Academy of Finland. And I hand back to Cordelia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jens. And some themes I'm picking up on there are the sort of the burden of compliance, and maybe tying that back into what we've already heard, the state role, or the role you mentioned, these bilateral treaties and institutions, and how that's going to evolve. One quick housekeeping item before we go to our last presenter. After this, we're going to begin to introduce Q&A from the in-person and online audience. If you're online, please go ahead and submit your questions, and we'll take them as they come. And please go ahead and include your affiliation and name, as that's what the in-person audience will need to do as well. Mikael, close us out.
All right. What I thought of, this has been really interesting so far, and what I thought of throwing out here is really the slightly arrogant idea of geoeconomics to at least some extent coming to replace global market economics as the paradigm, or as the narrative, as Tobias would like to call it, guides the behavior of states, both states and corporation, both states and economic actors. So to contextualize a bit, since roughly the 1970s, at least since the 1990s, market economics has been guiding policymakers in many states. And as an approach to economics, market economics is really concerned with the opening of markets, of course, for international trade and finance, giving market actors a free rein in deciding where economic activity takes place. And as a result, corporations have been globalizing their supply chains and to take advantage of specialization and maximize efficiency, giving rise to this deepening economic interdependence across the globe, right? Policymakers have taken a very benign view of this deepening interdependence for both economic and for political reasons. Economically, interdependence has been assumed to maximize economic gains and efficiency, and for states, by increasing the economic efficiency within and across their economies. Politically, interdependence has been assumed to incentivize cooperation and constrain conflicts between states. Right? Now, this belief has been broken. At least this has been seriously tainted. So the era of global market economics is, I'm not saying it's coming to an end yet, but it's certainly will not be the reigning paradigm for long and the reigning narrative for long. And the question is what comes next? And I'm arguing that geoeconomics comes next. However, so far as an analytical framework, a paradigm or a theory, a narrative, geoeconomics has mostly been concerned with state behavior, the way states try to outdo each other in the economic domain or with economic means. Right? That's the sort of geo in geoeconomics. Far less thought has gone into what sort of economics is geoeconomics, and what that means for non-state actors who operate in this new economic environment. But the picture is starting to emerge, and we've heard some of that picture which is starting to emerge here already before. FDI investment screening, not only inbound screening, but also screening of outbound investments, right? Sanctions and export controls, data localization requirements, new industrial policy, restrictions on science and technology cooperation, ally and friend shoring. So companies will be increasingly unfree to decide where and with whom they interact, at least to start with, especially in strategic sectors with important security repercussions, high-tech, critical infrastructure, critical services. And mind you, that is not traditional geopolitical risk, a conflict somewhere or a new socialist government somewhere taking over economic policy making. These are geoeconomic risks, and those are different. Those are transnational, and those are not conjunctural. They will not go away. They are here to stay, right? And they're not totally exogenous, but because there's geoeconomic agency for corporations to actually affect that situation. So you cannot manage geoeconomic risks by traditional geopolitical risk frameworks. You have to renew your framework. So what we're witnessing with the rise of geoeconomics is a shift of the economic model from a free market model or a market capitalist model to what we sort of been calling here strategic capitalism. Right? In strategic capitalism, the state intervenes heavily in certain sectors of the economy, strategic sectors of the economy with security repercussions. Those that are of heavily strategic natures. Other sectors are left to laissez-faire, right? Which also makes this model very different from traditional state capitalism. It's not that the state starts to intervene all over the board in the economy. It will intervene in certain particular sectors, very much high-tech, because those are of strategic nature for the power politics that goes on, right? So the security concerns is what drives intervention for the state. It's not economic reasons as such, actually. And it's not political reasons, as in state capitalism, where the Communist Party wants to keep control of the whole economy because it's a threat to the regime. So that's the economic model we'll have to adjust to in Western countries from now on. And it comes with two challenges. 30 seconds, I'll explain the challenges. The first challenge with this new economic model is that it's the slippery slope state capitalism to the Beijing model, where all sectors are suddenly start to be defined as strategic, and the state starts to intervene here and there and more and more. So one challenge is how to manage that slippery slope, how to steer clear of it. The other challenge is the economic security dilemma that Tobias was alluding to, and also Ashley here. There's a security dilemma with strategic capitalism when we start to apply FDI screening mechanism and restrictions on that and that export controls. the others will have to respond to it. So there's a tit for tat, a tug of war starts to build up, an escalation of protectionism. So how do we manage that economic security dilemma that gets going with this new economic model, unless we want to end up in a total decoupled world? Those are the two policy challenges, and I think, Tobias, your work also speaks to that security dilemma to a large extent, which is good. And Ashley's work, of course, on balancing has a lot to do with this economic security dilemma, which we haven't done research enough on yet. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mikael. Now you see why that reviewer that Mikael mentioned in the introduction said high risk, high reward. It all begins to make a bit of sense. So I'm going to open it up actually to questions from the audience. So I'm going to take questions in batches of 3. Please raise your hand, wait for the microphone. When you have the microphone, please identify yourself, your institution, and then please tell us whether your question is intended for one or a couple panelists or the entire panel. So go ahead. Yeah, we need an icebreaker question. Okay, I see one here at the front.
Thank you. Thank you. Niina Hyvärinen, and I'd actually like to ask a question from whoever wants to pick up on that. And really thank you. This has been really thought-provoking now, like hearing your introduction, so I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. I was actually wondering, you be referring to corporations and non-state actors, but how do you see, like in practice, like the multinational companies that are not necessarily looking at from a certain state perspective, but have a wider sort of look in the markets and playing this whole global playing field, and also the role of international institutions like G7 and G20. Like, what are those places where the discussions will actually take place in future? Because you'd be referring to security, for example, and seeing the role of Security Council, like in this context. It would be interesting to hear your views on that. Thank you.
And then we have just one at the end, the woman with the...
Thank you. My name is Anni Norring. I work as a senior economist in international affairs at the Bank of Finland. Thank you for a very interesting panel. This was extremely thought-provoking, as the previous member of the audience already alluded to. My question is to the whole panel. There are 2 themes that are currently very much debated on the global economic and economic policy arenas that you actually, I don't think that any of you mentioned. So I would love to hear your views on those. So the first one is the potential fragmentation of the global economy due to geopolitical tensions. And the other one is the costs, the potentially very vast costs of this type of fragmentation to the global economy. So thank you.
Great, and we have one that I'm going to take from online, which is to the entire panel. And the question is, on the Transatlantic Alliance, is there a risk that in an attempt to encircle China by deepening the economic, political, and military relationships with the ASEAN countries and India, the geoeconomic weight will shift to Asia? And if so, what might the consequences be for the European Union? So I think we'll take the responses to those questions in the same order that we presented. Tobias, go ahead.
Great. Maybe I can go on the first question, international institutions, because are run by states, and that's a bit more maybe my cup of tea. So I think that's a really, really big question. You mentioned the G7 and G20. For me, the biggest question revolves around the World Trade Organization and the future. And that's a really strategic question for Europe, I think, where to go. The big question is basically, if the Americans withdrawing support from the WTO, can it survive? Right? Can the WTO, an open trade system, survive without the most important economy actively supporting it? And I think we're quite split in Europe, at least, on this question. We would kind of stick to this idea that it can be stuck. There's people like Pascal Lamy, former trade commissioner, former head of the WTO. So he comes up with these papers and say, paraphrasing, he basically says, screw the Americans. We just should build an open trade system with everyone else and exclude the Americans. And the pressure will be so high that we can continue this trade system and the Americans will lose out and eventually they'll come back. I am very, very skeptical about this. I don't think we can continue the kind of Cold War economic institutions that were built on a political, on a security foundation that does not exist anymore. It's eroding in front of our eyes. And I don't think we can pretend to keep these institutions running as they did in the last couple of years without finding a new security foundation. Concretely, for example, for the WTO, I think it needs some sort of security valve where we can do certain protectionisms, national security interventions that allow America and China and Europe and others to coexist while keeping some parts still open. But the way the WTO, for example, is structured now, I don't think it has a future. It will not blow up, but it will just move into the sort of the backbench of international institutions, like so many, the International Labour Organization, right? What does it do? It doesn't do much. It's in the backbench of international organizations. I think what we need to do is try to save these institutions. But there will be other institutions. The G7 has become an incredibly powerful new. That's not new, but it has sort of has gained some life again into trying to manage some of these geoeconomic pressures on supply chains, on coercion, on industrial policy. So I think there will be new forums that are already emerging that will be much more important in the future. I'm also going to say one provocative thing still on the fragmentation. I know there's a couple of reports. The IMF is very active of bringing out reports, and I'm sure your bank also, about the costs of fragmentation. But I don't know, it says 2% of global GDP is the cost of fragmentation, which to me, not an economist, but political economist, doesn't sound so much for the fact that we gain a certain level of resilience. And these costs are not distributed evenly, of course. Some developing countries will have to pay more for this if we don't manage it well. But I think this argument of the cost of fragmentation seemed to me a little bit overblown when there is a real resilience question that we have to address. We shouldn't go overboard on national securitization of everything, but resilience comes at a certain price, and I think that we have to count in. And so the 2% of the IMF, I'm skeptical.
I'm a little more optimistic. So, and I think part of this is taking the long lens of history, right? I mean, if you look at one of the biggest examples is foreign investment screening, right? Which is quite new to a lot of European countries. In the US, it's quite an old function. It actually was born originally out of World War I, though it wasn't fully set up in the way we know it until the 70s. But Australia, Canada, the US, New Zealand have been doing these things for a very long time. And if you speak to individuals within these governments who have been active in this space long before it became a topic in geoeconomics in these kind of forums, the key word was always balance, right? Not just balancing power, that's my theoretical concept and the way I understand things from an IR lens, but about balancing national security concerns versus the real benefits of a free and open market and many aspects of globalization and integration. And if you look at the logic of interdependence, it was never that conflict wouldn't happen, right? The idea of promoting interdependence through, a liberal economic order or whatever you want to call it today was that it would reduce the likelihood of great power hot war against each other. And even with Ukraine, we're still in that space. And part of that is down to the deep integration of our economies with each other, with China, with other countries. And I think it's important to remember that, even as we kind of all wake up to some of the dangers that are real around national security in this space and the balancing that we do need to do. On the role of international organizations, I think the OECD does a really, really wonderful job in this space, whether it's on competition and monopolies or foreign investment and national security, the promotion of dialogues across a host of countries, including representatives from China, from Russia, from other countries, in these dialogues, even though they are not part of the OECD, in kind of focusing on best practices to achieve that balance is quite important. So I see a great role for them. I think on the I mean, I touched on this a bit with the fragmentation and the transatlantic alliance, but I think one of the important things to remember, Litvak called geoeconomics, the logic of conflict and the grammar of commerce, right? I think we have to be careful not to go into the logic of conflict and the grammar of conflict, just in the economic sphere. So that's an important thing to remember. And I think if we can be aware of the risks and focus on those while also trying to maintain an open trading environment, the importance of the WTO, and all of these things, which when you said 2%, that made me very nervous because I thought back to when I was living in Britain before Brexit, and you heard these really spurious comments about, how little effect there would be once you lost your trading agreements, and I'm pretty sure they're regretting that now. So, I do think we have to be wary about some of these predictions as well. So, and I see that as somebody who's fully in favor of a lot of these mechanisms and tools of statecraft. So I will turn it over to you with that.
Thank you. I'll just pick up on the question where you left off, and actually your first question here, which relates to which I would consider geoeconomic cooperation. So we're coming at geoeconomics from the perspective of conflict, but there's more to that, and we're going to discuss that in the next session as well. So it's just not about conflict; it's also about cooperation. It's also about compliance, but it's about many different other aspects that we're now it's opening up to us, like a flower in a sense. And so when we're talking about structures for such cooperation, it's also interesting to see what are geoeconomic cooperation structures going to be like. And we can already see some tendencies to, or some ideas, or some contours of what that might be like. It may not be something that looks like the WTO or the European Union. I think we can look at some recent examples of how great powers like to organize and coordinate politically. And maybe a move away from treaties and international formality to informal platforms. So we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Dialogue, for example, or the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. I think very interesting examples. We could also take a look at AUKUS, which is, of course, a limited purpose military setup, but it's an interesting setup because it's a hub and spoke axis type of constellation, which, when you think through it, is also possibly replicable in the geoeconomic sphere. And recently, out of the G7 came this idea of a coordination platform for economic coercion, CPEC, which, although lacks very much detail, and there are many things that we could discuss for a long time about both how they conceptualize coercion and so forth, but it's an interesting development nonetheless. And so turning over to the back of Finland question about fragmentation, so I would like to just add to this. I can't answer the question about cost, but it is an interesting question. But I think it's also conceptually a lot of work needs to be done. So what you could identify and conceptualize as a cost needs to be readjusted, because there is very little today that takes into consideration security externalities. There's a bit written on it. It's theorized, but we are not there yet to actually put a number on it. But when you take security externalities, and I was originally educated in economics at the Stockholm School of Economics, not political economy. So I discovered political economy only later on, and felt it very liberating, actually. But if you go back to the economics models have a lot more legwork to do to catch up to these developments, because it's really very difficult to modify the assumptions underpinning macroeconomics and microeconomics today, but it is necessary because the model doesn't really fit reality. And although there are ideas to incorporate and adjust models for security externalities, much the way that environmental degradation is handled by economic models, it's not happening today with security. And when you put that into perspective and rejig the numbers, you will probably come out with a lot less costs than at first glance. So that it was a little bit of a theoretical deep dive. I hand over to Mikael, and yeah.
Yeah, I'll pick up I'll try to pick up on all four questions as I saw them. Multinational companies and the state, their interest might converge or diverge. The multinational companies have a lot of what we would call geoeconomic agency, power, to to shape their own strategies. I will talk more about it in the next session, right? On the different strategies multinational companies have. They can try to defend status quo, be against the politicization of the economy that now takes place, and lobby for that. I think they have power sort of to push back, of course. But they will not be entirely successful because states see it differently now. So the old might not go on as before. Multinational companies can try to play on both sides. If we have fragmentation, Tesla is having set up new factories in China, despite everything that the US does to contain China. Tesla is still setting up new factories in China and tries to play on both sides, and it can do that. It's really a powerful company, right? Or states can try state capture and actually play along and try to get all the subsidies coming out from this nice rise of geoeconomics, right? So it can actually try to play with the state very much, sort of a state capture strategy, right? So that's with that. Jens already touched upon a bit on the G7 and what's happening there now, the coordination around economic coercion. I think we will see more of that, not only when it comes to economic coercion, but export controls, all sorts of these new instruments that are taken into play now. During the Cold War, let me remind you that there was a thing called COCOM that was trying to coordinate export controls during the Cold War in order to keep the front strong against the Soviet Union, so that Soviet Union couldn't get its hands on technology. It was a difficult thing for the Europeans. They tried to push back at the US during the Cold War against this. It worked so-so, right? But we will see those kinds of things, I think, when it comes to that sort of coordination. And US will certainly try to come up with different forms with that. We also have coordination now on semiconductors, and the Netherlands are there, South Korea, and so on and forth. There's that sort of coordination now taking place as well. Now, with the questions on fragmentation and sort of third big countries and Asian countries, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and all sorts of these countries, where will they go sort of in the fragmenting economy? And certainly it is fragmenting the economy, right? What I would call balkanization is taking place. It's these global economic networks are falling into smaller networks, more regionalization, regional nature, economic spheres of interest. That's happening in the world economy right now. So where will these big countries go, which are not sort of transatlantic side or not China or Russia? Well, there will be competition for those countries to bind them into your own sphere of interest. The US are already coming up with new initiatives for inducements, not only sanctions, but inducements, to induce and lure them and give economic carrots to them to bring them in there, right? The problem is that there have been so much sanctions used that these countries are already hedging. They're already thinking about alternative financial institutions and mechanisms so as not to be so vulnerable to sanctions, so as not to be so bound up, dependent on the US economy. And that's, of course, aiding the fragmentation even more, right? Because that's so. But I think there's a slight, perhaps, change of mindset now that sanctions cannot only be the sort of thing how we handle. There needs to be these carrots, inducement sides of things as well, so that we don't end up with this very fragmented economy.
Great. I'm going to take at least 2 questions from the audience and then 2 from online. We'll start with one at the very back, since he had his just behind you. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Mika Matlin, also from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My question is addressed to my namesake, Mikael, and his talk. Very thought-provoking, very insightful. I agree with almost everything you said. Only one minor comment and sort of ending with a question related to how you described this danger of strategic capitalism actually turning into state capitalism, the kind of thing that we would have in China. If you go back 10 years in time, arguably you could make the case that what China was then, what the Chinese economy was, or what the Chinese state was trying to do, it was looking like something like what you describe as strategic capitalism, not state capitalism, because it wasn't across the board trying to very heavy-handedly control all sectors of society. I mean, there were certainly sort of in what you would call strategic industries, there was a very strong presence, heavy ownership, a lot of regulation, and the state certainly was very big there. Later on, strategic emerging industries and so on. There was a whole range of other sectors of the economy that were not actually that influenced by the state, and you can see that even in sort of the lending of state-related banks and so on. Now that has shifted. It has shifted very much over the past 10 years. But my question is really: is it really as big a danger that strategic capitalism would turn into state capitalism in countries that are sort of, to begin with, very different from China? Because China has, of course, a very unique sort of party state, a very strong state machinery. It has a very different kind of economic policy political background as well, with a system that was very dominated by the state prior to reforms. So, how realistic is it to this danger? Thank you.
Okay, and then the gentleman who's standing in the blue.
Hey, Jarkko Nissinen, parliamentary assistant for MP Aura Salla at the Parliament of Finland. Thank you so much for the great conversation thus far. My question is addressed to Jens. I really liked your definition of geoeconomics 1.0 and 2.0. And from the geoeconomics 2.0, we have, you have discussed great examples of case Huawei, Tesla, big companies taking and exploiting that geoeconomic agency they have. And however, going to the geoeconomics 0.01, we see de facto China, for example, could say sacrificing, their global finance centers like Shanghai or Hong Kong, or the importance, reducing the importance of the financial importance for their strategic interests. And something that was in the heart of German Ostpolitik and for Finland for many years, that the economic collaboration would lead to, economic collaboration would lead to, this kind of like better outcome that we've seen now in Russia-Ukraine war, for example. So maybe my question to you is that is this division and the intrinsic tension between the geoeconomics 1.0 and geoeconomics 2.0, is it identified well in the current academic literature? And thank you.
Excellent. And then I'm going to take two from the online, which are actually perfect because one is for Ashley and one is for Tobias. So for Tobias, you mentioned the G7. What do you think the role of green industrial policy to preserve the geoeconomic power, it plays in the role of the geoeconomic power for the G7 and like-minded partners? And then for Ashley, how can we explain the convergence and divergence for different member states, especially in terms of incoming and outbound screening? Why are some of them so restrictive and some are more tolerant, even though they have higher technology? We'll go in reverse order this time. So, Mikael?
All right, yeah, thanks, Mikael. That's a great question on the challenge and the risk with strategic capitalism sliding into state capitalism, so an all overboard intervention. Now, I think there's less of a risk of it in democratic systems, of course, because they will be pushed back against it. Companies can make use of the democratic infrastructure, our court systems and our private rights legislation, and all sorts of that goes with the democratic system to push back against it going over the board, so to speak, because there's a lot of sectors that do not want to end up in state capitalism, of course. So less of a risk, but it's a matter of degree in a way, and I think that matter of a degree will be contentious. So a lot of our politics will revolve around that contentious issue. How far should we go in that direction, or how less of a direction towards strategic or state capital should we go? And I think our sort of geoeconomic innenpolitik, geoeconomic domestic politics will revolve around this issue very much. What are the strategic sectors that we need to intervene with more and control more for the state. Paracetamols, it was a question in France. Is it a strategic thing for France to produce itself, or can we rely on others producing and we importing it? Hollywood movies in the US, is it a strategic sector? Propaganda? Can we have Chinese investments going into Hollywood? Is that a strategic sector? Can we allow it or not? Face masks. Is it strategic or not? Can we rely on getting our face masks in times of crisis or not? There will be a lot of these sort of discussions around issues, what are strategic or not, and how to define that, and that will be contentious.
Is it the mic? Okay. So let me begin by, if I may, add an appendix or an addendum to what you just said in respect to Professor Matlin's question there, and I add this perspective as being coming from the law side, part of our law and geoeconomics project. There is, I believe, a danger. I would slightly modify my view of the danger of that slippery slope on the basis that having observed how the legal system treats a concept such as security, and this makes no big difference if you look at domestic legal systems or the international legal systems, and in the international system we have had cases of security coming before the appellate body, before panels of the WTO, as well as before investment arbitration tribunals, and there have been cases before domestic courts, such as the famous Rawls case in the United States on investment screening. Judges are extremely reluctant to have an opinion about a notion so nebulous and yet so strategic and vital as security. And that has given the executive branch of government very big leeway in pushing those limits. Now, theoretically, security is also not easy to pin to the wall, as probably a lot of us here in the room know. There are various ideas about what security means, more or less expansive definition that might include human security, environmental security, climate security, food security, and so forth. What is security? This is something that I'm convinced from a legal perspective will never be possible to crystallize. And because it is so difficult to crystallize, I don't think that we will ever have any real safety in that slippery slope. So it remains a problem, I believe. Moreover, these are matters that some courts are not even willing to hear. And they simply push back as inadmissible. The court will not even look at it. So that deprives the individual from a legal remedy to actually enforce their rights. It's a whole conversation by itself, but I just wanted to add that as a little bit of a particular footnote. Coming back to the question that was directed to me, how well ultimately how well identified are this sort of problem, this tipping point, these questioning of assumptions of corporate behavior or business behavior in economic literature. Now, unfortunately, they are not. And I think this is the real novelty of what we are trying to achieve here. Nobody else have actually gone this route. And it has different reasons, because the whole area of geoeconomics is still in its infancy. There is a frantic there's a frantic activity on the literature front or research front. This is mostly contained within the international political economy community and the international security studies community. And we're happy to and excited to be part of that literature, but there is so much still to be done. So yeah, the short answer is no.
I'm just cognizant of the time, so we definitely have time for you two to finish. If everyone is okay that we run over a bit, we've got quite a long coffee break, and it seems like everyone's quite engaged in the conversation. So long as that is okay with you. Sorry, Ashley, to cut you off. Back to you.
No, I will be quick. I think that they're asking about the convergence and divergence within the EU.
Okay.
But I'm not sure, so I'm gonna answer both.
Okay.
From both perspectives. So if we look at the history of investment screening mechanisms, basically all states under international law have the right to block a foreign investment on national security grounds. It's well founded, and states do it without having an investment screening mechanism. What the screening mechanisms do is not only give the domestic jurisdiction for kind of constant review and monitoring, but they also actually provide some security to investors to know what's coming and what's possible. So what we have seen is the adoption of security screening mechanisms over time by countries that have had bad experiences with foreign investment, right? So the isms that were set up in the U.S., were really after some particularly spurious investments. The original kind of precursor of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States came as a result of strategic German investment during World War I and World War II, and was born out of that experience, and then a concern later over Japanese and certain other forms of investment that in particular sectors, particularly semiconductors, that really led to the birth of more modern legislation and screening mechanisms. Within the EU and Europe as a whole, we've seen in the UK after Hinkley Point C and arms purchase by SoftBank and a proposed purchase of a particular pharma company in the UK that the government didn't feel comfortable screening because it wasn't, possible under their current legislation. Very quick, rapid accession to a new form of screening. Same in Germany. Same, resurgence of screening in Italy and France for the same reasons. Adaptations of older mechanisms that they improved. So we've seen that movement to adopt, where there have been issues. Countries that are less willing to do so in the EU are obviously the ones who really require foreign investment for their economies to work. They're nervous about the possibility that those investment screening mechanisms might be seen as a deterrent to foreign investment. We actually don't see that when we look across the history of investment screening mechanisms, as long as they're used well and proportionally. And actually cases of, even in the US, right? Cases of companies being blocked from investments are very rare when you look at the overall proportion of investment in the country and then the number of M&As and asset purchases each year. It's extremely rare. So it's just the ones that are really politicized. And I think we will see this pattern, though, of greater adoption of these mechanisms as we see more strategic investment from various actors, right? Not just China. Many countries, and over history, the country of concern and their strategic investments has changed, right? In World War I and World War II, it was Germany, and later there was concern over Japan, whether warranted or not. Later there was concern over certain Middle Eastern country investments, whether warranted or not. So you will see these patterns over time, but I think it's more likely that we'll see, especially in the coming years, the adoption of mechanisms more globally, especially in countries like Latin America, where there has been a sudden waking up to the amount of Chinese investment in really critical sectors that the country no longer controls, right? Particularly in the area of energy and in mining, that is becoming a big concern. So I think we'll see those changes coming. The challenge for the EU with the convergence and divergence, if this is what this person was asking, is that unless you do have a coherent system where every state is screening and monitoring appropriately, you essentially have a very open backdoor to any economy in the EU. And that is a really great danger. Because I said, as long as you use these mechanisms well, it doesn't have to deter investment at all. But if you don't have them and you don't see what's coming, you can really make yourself very vulnerable in a worrying way.
Very interesting. Ashley is teasing my ability to restrain myself as chair because I cover mining and critical raw materials.
Yes.
So
we have lots to talk about.
I'm going to have you answer that, Tobias. But actually, I would like you to touch on Ashley's last point there about the ability of the EU to meet this and whether that's in place. So both the G7 and then if you could tack on the EU too, because I know that that's something that you cover a lot in your research.
Oh dear. Well, let me try to give a very brief green industrial policy. Is it something very important? I think it's absolutely crucial for at least 3 reasons. The first one is that if we're serious about addressing supply chain dependencies, which we should, obviously I think that, there's no way around a level of state intervention, especially in some of these green energy technology supply chains. Right? The reason China is processing plus 90% of cobalt and 95% of rare earths and so on in China is not because it's a super great market efficiency. It's not a functioning market at all. It's the effect of a lot of direct, especially indirect subsidies in China that's completely distorting the market that we cannot otherwise address. Right? China has a super good production capacity, integrated port systems, roads, infrastructure, but they're all not market-based efficient. They are heavily subsidized. So to break that dependency, it will not be enough to just have another trade agreement with Chile. It won't. You have to intervene into the market. And so having some sort of coordination with partners on this is critical for that reason, for the first reason. The second reason is that I think it is important for Europe, but for everyone, to keep certain strategic industries. Certain industries are just simply strategic. That doesn't mean we should have to produce everything in Europe or that we have to be autark in these. But I think it's important to remain key players in these value chains. And many of the green energy tech value chains are, I think, strategic. That doesn't mean we have to produce all of it, but it means we have to remain indispensable in these. And there's a risk that some European countries or others are being thrown out of these supply chains because of what's happening in China and in America with the IRA. And so there is no other response but to address this. Also with industrial policy, there is a bit of a tit for tat. However, I don't think that's a necessarily bad thing. There's this idea that we are running an industrial subsidy war and it's a race to the bottom. But I really don't think that's necessarily true. I think that idea of how we fight the green energy, the climate change, the days of the Kyoto world where we have to come together and cooperate and set international standards are over, it seems pretty bad, but I think this geoeconomic competition over who is winning these industries is, I think, helping a lot. There's a lot of money flowing. The IRA has attracted already hundreds of millions of private capital in what American government identified as strategic. There's a huge inflow of capital into these sectors that I think is partly a response to this state competition over who remains part of these value chains. So, I think that's one of these sectors where I actually think geoeconomic competition, if you will, is beneficial. It's not everywhere, not in all sectors, but for the green energy transition, I think we see some positive effects. And we don't have to always think back to the days of Kyoto where we all came together and agreed together. I think this level of competition is quite helpful here to really get into this mission drive of a clean economy. Let me just leave it here. Sorry, I didn't address your fair point.
Great. I've seen that we have a couple more questions in the audience. I'm going to suggest, in the interest of time and making sure that everyone gets a break, that we take those questions out to the coffee reception room and carry on the conversation there. If you're online and you have a question that wasn't answered, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. I'm sure that they would be happy to engage with you on this topic. Thank you to our audience. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists for this very engaging presentation.
We just now we're good to go for the second session. So welcome back from the break, everyone. This second session is a book launch. It's a book launch of Political Economy of Geoeconomics: Europe in a Changing World, which was published in 2022, I think, according to the inside of the book, but it sort of got delivered and distributed early this year. It is a book edited by Milan Babic, Imogen Liu, and Adam Dixon. Milan researches the transformation from a neoliberal towards a post-neoliberal global order and is assistant professor of global political economy at Roskilde University in Denmark. Adam D. Dixon holds the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism at Edinburgh Business School at the Heriot-Watt University, and he's joining us, streaming it from the house where Adam Smith lived, and that's, I think, is pretty cool. And we're also joined by Imogen T. Liu, who is the assistant professor of international political economy at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where she researches China's role in global political economic change. The book, which also had the privilege of contributing a chapter together with my esteemed colleague Clara Weinhardt and Carsten Mau from Maastricht University, is a book that received very good appraisals and endorsement and positive reviews. It's a book that stands to become a major reference point in the field of geoeconomics and the political economy of geoeconomics in the coming years. It brings together researchers from different analytical perspectives for the study of contemporary geoeconomics. A good part of the book is published open access, in fact, and it's made possible through support by the European Research Council under the EU Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme, another chapter by the Studio Europa research grant for early career scholars, which I myself had the privilege of receiving, and the Luxembourg National Research Fund, among others. The book will now be discussed, and to do that, I will hand it over to you guys, the editors, who will present a short summary of what the book is about. And we'll then continue to hear a sample chapter, and that sample chapter is the chapter co-authored by Michael Bigel, my colleague, as well as Henrique Cormorais, and deals with corporate geoeconomics. And we'll then hand over to our discussant, Ashley, and we'll then open up for discussion on the floor. So over to you guys.
Yes, thanks a lot, Jens, for the very nice introduction and for your nice words. We feel very humbled about that, and it's also nice to actually, after publication, hear a bit about, the fact that this has been, endorsed and reviewed by many great people, and that actually the book is, on its way of making an impact, and that's always nice to hear. And I'm really sorry that I can't be in Helsinki. It's the end of the semester, so it's a bit stressful. I'm actually now in between meetings, so after this I have to jump to another meeting. But it's nice that all of you are there, and I hope that we can meet at some point in the future again, maybe in Helsinki or elsewhere. So the way this is going to go is that I'll give a short introduction to what we were thinking while doing this project, and some of the reasons for actually doing it, and the way how we did it. And then Imogen will say a bit about the chapters, and have a conclusion about that before I think Ashley or Mikael takes over. Okay, so the project, as Jens said, this has been published last year. It's an edited volume. It emerged out of an ECPR session we organized originally in Innsbruck, but then because of COVID, it got moved online. And the book is, I think, most unis should have full access, at least in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands, via Springer. And as Jens already said, many chapters are actually open access, so you don't need to necessarily buy the very expensive, I have to say, hard book version. I just saw the other day when I was preparing for this that the ebook was really cheap. I'm not sure if it still is, but Springer sometimes has these sales. So if you're interested, you can maybe check out the webpage or write to one of us. Yeah, as I said, it's an edited volume. Imogen is going to say a bit about the chapters, but I'm just going to give you a short background to that. So here on the left side, you see which you're probably all familiar with, Fukuyama's End of History, which was published in 1992, actually. I had somehow in my mind that it was in the 80s, but it was in 1992. And on the right side, you see the End of History, which was published almost 30 years later in 2021. I'm not trying to compare here the two books, which are, I guess, about different things. So the right one is it's basically a summary of a series of podcasts by the authors. But what this nicely illustrates is, I think, also one of the motivations of us for writing this book, for assembling people who will then write the chapters, is that we live in tumultuous times, right? So you could say that Fukuyama's book was published at the apex of what we would call neoliberal globalization, or some other people would probably call it the liberal international order, however you want to look at it. The book on the right side was actually published, I would say, in the end times of what we would call neoliberal globalization, right? So at least in a phase of the politicization of this order, or of this phase of international politics. And what is happening now is basically that the global political economy is becoming more unwieldy, more complex, more antagonistic. That's very different from the phase that we've seen before, where you had this sort of Quinn Slobodin called it the encasement of economic policy making, so that economic policy making wasn't really, it was contested but not really politicized in a way, right? So it was a sphere of that was removed from, I would say, democratic influence and also from politics, broadly speaking. And now we're moving into this phase that's more politicized. And there are many descriptions for that, right? So Abe Newman and Henry Farrell called it weaponized interdependence, right? So the weaponization of previously established global connections by different powerful actors. Others use this idea of economic statecraft, which is an older idea going back to the 1950s. Others, like Sophie Meunier and others, call it the geopolitization of trade and investment. And however you want to call it, what we're trying to do in this book is to say, okay, these kind of concepts or ideas, they speak to the same phenomenon, right? Which is the rise of geoeconomics as what we call a new global modus operandi. So what does it mean? It means that we don't really see geoeconomics as just yet another concept to be added to the many concepts that exist out there, like geopolitics or whatever. But it's rather describing the changing patterns of interaction in the global political economy, which go from a sort of neoliberal globalization mode to a more geoeconomic mode. And just to give you an idea of what this kind of abstract description means, what we try in the introduction of the book is to say, okay, there is this discussion about geoeconomics and geopolitization, and we want to go a bit beyond that, because what we see happening today with the end of or the crisis of neoliberal globalization is that a lot of these ideas that are floating around, for example, geopolitics or geoeconomics, are not really fitting what we're seeing. So, for example, if you think about Luttwak and this kind of tradition that looked at geoeconomics as a new mode of doing geopolitics, so geopolitics through other means, that was very much focused on conflict, right? So it's about doing geopolitics in a globalized world. And that what we say, or what we do in the introduction, is to say, okay, but conflict is not the only mode in which international relations or global relations are being conducted. So, for example, we see competition, which I think is something different than conflict, also between allies. So just think about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the reactions of European policymakers to that. So there's a clear dynamic of competition there, trying to match the IRA subsidies and all the implications of it. And I would say that's also a geoeconomic phenomenon. We see also cooperation. So, for example, Imogen's work is a really nice example of that, where Chinese sovereign wealth funds, state-owned entities, basically cooperate with Irish and other state-owned entities to make money, to exert influence, right? And usually, if you think about conflict, that shouldn't be the case, right? That state-owned companies or state-owned entities cooperate with other state-owned entities. And we also see, of course, a lot of coexistence. So we often focus a lot on this Sino-US Cold War and maybe a little bit on Europe, but there are also other parts of the world that that also play a role, and they seem to coexist in this new Cold War, or you want to call it. The second point is that we try to go a bit beyond what I would say is a realist bias or realist drive towards state centrism. Again, if you think about Luttwak and about the old geoeconomic discussion, it's very much centered on what states are doing. If you look at the global political economy of today, you'll see that a lot of the actors that are really important are actually not states, and that their power has actually increased in the last years. So we see all these tech oligopolies and monopolies. We see Chinese state-owned enterprises becoming really huge in the last 10 to 15 years. And they have agency, right? And they have interest. And they also influence what is happening under this umbrella of geoeconomic or of the new geoeconomic relations across the world, right? And we are basically reiterating Susan Strange here and saying, okay, we should actually look at the producers. She called it the producers of wealth, but I would say there are also much more than producers of wealth. And finally, and that's something that probably Ashley and Michael also have to say something about, is that we want to go beyond security. I know it's contested what security actually means and can mean a lot of things. But just as a simple argument, I would say that, for example, these huge corporations that are also part of the new geoeconomics are not, they don't really have, I mean, they take into account security considerations, but they're not really interested in augmenting security, right? They're interested in making a profit, for example, or contribute to development or capture markets or whatever under the conditions of geoeconomic relations, right? So they have to take that into account, but it's not necessarily their first priority. So with these three aspects, we're trying to conceptually broaden and empirically specify, and I would emphasize this empirically specify because there's a lot of work still to be done. Geoeconomics is an analytical tool for international political economy. Most of the authors in the book come from one or the other corner of IPE. So it makes sense to frame it in that way. It puts Europe on the map, which is an outcome actually of the chapters that have been contributed, which were mostly about Europe. And while we were editing the book, we realized at some point, okay, this is very much about what the EU is doing, what European countries are doing, and there is actually a lack of discussion and debate, at least academically, and at least in 2021 when we started the project, about what the role of Europe is in this so-called new Cold War between China and the US. And finally, it sets a research agenda, I would say, for the decade, at least in IPE and the question of geoeconomics within that field. Okay, so that's it from me. And now it's Imogen's turn. And Imogen, you have to tell me when to switch the slides.
Will do. Thanks so much, Milan. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of the chapters before fleshing out our research agenda that we have proposed based on contributions in the volume for understanding geoeconomics moving forward. So first chapter that comprise the body chapters in the volume is called Balancing Dependence, Quest for Autonomy and the Rise of Corporate Geoeconomics by Koen Moraes and Mikkel, which since they're going to be presenting about this, I'm not going to specify too much the content of the chapter, but point out that they draw attention to the commonalities and differences of geoeconomic strategies wielded by different actors. Specifically, they differentiate between balancing dependence as a state strategy versus corporate geoeconomics as a corporate strategy. And a key proposition that we can take away from the chapter is that, different from neoliberal globalization, state and corporate strategies will, in a world of geoeconomic competition, converge on geostrategic issues. Moving to the next chapter by Lavery, McDaniels, and Schmidt on European strategic autonomy. So they chart the strategic autonomy project in recent years, demonstrating its development, diffusion, and divergence among key actors. The authors recognize the persistence of old European cleavages over the appropriate way of governing the European political economy. So specifically, they argue that the emerging conflicts we see over strategic autonomy resemble familiar rows between the Europeanists and the Atlanticists from the 1980s and the 1990s. Milan, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. The chapter 4 by Veselinovic analyzes the role of foreign policy think tanks. So he argues that these think tanks play an important role in the discursive transformation of the EU from a normative to a geo-economic power in recent years. Veselinovic holds that the Europeanization of geo-economic debates is a key political objective of these think tanks and their agency in the process. Moving on to chapter 5 by Weinhardt, Mao, and Hillebrand-Pohl, traces whether the European geo-economic turn delivered tangible changes in actual policy making. So they look into 3 cases on investment screening, most favored nation clauses, and free trade agreements, and the EU's reaction to the China Belt and Road Initiative. And they find that the geo-economic turn of the EU is rather a programmatic label than one reflected in material changes of EU foreign economic policy. And moving to the next chapter, thanks Milan, by Codenbrock and Mertens, and they focus on the case of Germany and its foreign policy transformations, putting them center stage and arguing that the country is slowly morphing from an actor reluctant to engage in robust foreign economic policies to a serious geo-economic actor, tracing the sources for this transformation at the intersection of the German growth model and a changing global order. And the last chapter by Balmas and Doré uncovers the role of Luxembourg as a, as a conduit for Chinese state-owned bank investment into the EU. An important conceptual contribution of their study is that the exercise of geoeconomic strategy and power is really a one-way street. So they show how the intertwining of Chinese state-owned capital, international financial firms, and a small European jurisdiction creates a key geoeconomic moment for the EU, which is not rooted in cross-border coercion of one state by the other. And so from these 6 excellent chapters, we can identify 4 cross-cutting themes that for us point the way toward a research agenda that we see on geoeconomics moving forward. And the first cross-cutting theme we identify is the need to historicize geoeconomics. So several contributions in the volume belie the importance of conceptualizing geoeconomic phenomena within concrete, historically informed configurations of political and economic power. Geoeconomics does not imply a set of predefined structuring forces. Historicizing geoeconomics invites future research to pay more attention to institutional, temporal, and geographic specificities in prescribing what constitutes geoeconomics. The second cross-cutting theme we identify is that geoeconomics should be understood as a multi-layered phenomenon. Again, several contributions in our volume highlight the multi-layered nature of the contestations that give rise and fall and fail to give rise to geoeconomic policy and practice. Conceptualizing geoeconomic phenomena as multi-layered and complex reflects the growing interdependence of the global political economy. Our third cross-cutting theme is that geoeconomics should be understood as a relational phenomenon. Again, several contributions to the volume have pushed the envelope further to highlight the relational network nature of geoeconomic phenomena and how such phenomena are co-constituted between different social agents, geographical sites, and political institutions. A key implication is how the reorientation of different actors toward more geoeconomic tools of economic policy making can be interpreted as a reaction to the geoeconomization of other global actors and structures. In short, geoeconomics begets geoeconomics in intensifying exchanges between actors in the global order. Last but not least, we see geoeconomics as a process intimately entwined with state transformation. This is the fourth and final cross-cutting theme in which the often implicit state transformations that geoeconomics has wrought in Europe and beyond implies that geoeconomics is not only a descriptive category that captures the changing landscape of foreign economic policy and new defensive trade and investment agendas. Rather, geoeconomic dynamics have also been accompanied by structural changes within the state. So just to wrap up, This research agenda should be seen as a reflection of our conceptual reworking of the term geoeconomics, extending it beyond a simple definition of power projection through commercial means. It is a modus operandi and an analytical approach that embeds state power projection within a highly interconnected global political economy, in which states are not the only actors wielding, contesting, and competing for geopolitical and economic power. And that's it. We look forward to receiving questions and dialoguing with participants at the book launch.
Thank you very much, Imogen and Milan, and for that. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Mikael to present his chapter.
Yep, thanks a lot, Jens, and thanks a lot for that overview of the book project, which was really an interesting, a really nice one. And we with Enrique, we certainly enjoyed taking part in it. We have yep, there we go. So I'll present our chapter that we wrote together with Enrique Moraes, a Brazilian diplomat. This is indeed, as we already heard, it's an open access chapter. You don't need to actually buy the book to read this chapter. It can be interesting. It can be downloaded from the book's website. And this chapter sorts of sets the broad analytical framework for some of the subsequent chapters, to some extent at least, and while also trying very concretely to look at both state and corporate behavior, as we already heard Imogen explain. Look at both state and corporate behavior in this new operating environment. The starting point for our chapter is really that the logic underpinning global economic relations is changing quite radically. We are moving away from the liberal or neoliberal, if you will, order towards an emerging, perhaps geoeconomic, but at least an emerging something else order. And it manifests itself in two main ways, as we see it. First, the old benign, slightly idealistic view of interdependence is over. States have now woken up to the fact that economic interdependencies can involve risks and vulnerabilities, and that it can be dangerous to become too dependent on external actors, especially rival ones. That's why we see now this new quest for autonomy. It's not only the EU that plays up its own strategic autonomy, an open strategic autonomy, and all the new policies that goes under that rubric of strategic autonomy in the EU. It's of course also that China focuses on its technological sovereignty, has been doing that for some time. We have the Made in China 2025 strategy, the dual circulation strategy of China. We have US's new industrial policies, very heavy new industrial policies with IRA, the CHIPS Act, and whatnot. So a sort of a struggle for autonomy is shaping up in states, which doesn't mean that we're abandoning interdependence altogether, of course. But strategic dependencies are certainly being scrutinized much more. And this is a major departure from neoliberal doctrine or liberal doctrine or global market economic doctrine from before that has very much been guiding policymaking in the post-Cold War era. Secondly, in economics and business, we're seeing a shift from a wholesale focus on efficiency towards a much stronger focus on resilience. So less just in time and more resilient supply chains. More stress testing of production and supply chains, diversification of supply chains and production, duplication of production sites, etc., and all that. Now, how to make sense of it all? How to make sense of this sort of changing logic of international politics, economics, and business? Well, neoliberalism and market economics can't really guide us here, cannot really guide us here. Both build on the idea of economic and security thinking being separated spheres of policymaking. And so they can't really fathom a situation in which economics and security policy and thinking and doctrine becomes enmeshed, which is now happening, and that we see today. Economic connectivity, the opening of markets, states letting market actors decide on where to invest, produce, or whom to trade with. These are all things that are being reversed, more or less, now, and to a large extent. So to understand why that is being done and how it is taking place, for that we need a new and different paradigm. And geoeconomics gives us that paradigm. So geoeconomics really draws from both international political economy perspectives and from international security studies, and combines these two very different literatures. And they need to be combined in order to understand what's going on in today's international system and its ramifications for also domestic politics and economics as well. So what we're doing with Enrique is that we're applying a geoeconomic framework in this chapter to look at three things. First, how state behavior is changing. Secondly, how corporate behavior is changing. And third, how state and business interact, which goes a long way to also explain how the order is changing, this transformation. And we do that especially by coming up with two new concepts, or quite new concepts. There are others that have been working on those concepts as well, actually certainly on the balancing concept, and Heiko Borchardt, for instance, on corporate geoeconomics, right? So the first concept that we sort of develop here is the concept of geoeconomic balancing. States have, of course, been balancing power for the last 3,000 years or something. And there's been a lot of theorizing has gone into understanding power balancing in military terms. Military balancing, there's been a lot of work on that and a lot of theories around that. Military balancing and military out of concern for territorial sovereignty. States balance militarily because they're concerned about the territorial sovereignty. Right? Much less theorizing has gone into balancing in economic terms. So how states are concerned about their economic autonomy, their ability to act independently, despite not being threatened territorially by anybody. Out of fear for weaponized interdependence, this new buzzword, and out of fear of geoeconomic power politics. So states start to balance their economic dependencies, and that may then create a chain reaction as well, a geoeconomic chain reaction, and an economic security dilemma. There's a lot of theorizing on security dilemmas in IR, but it has to do with military security dilemmas usually, not about economic security dilemmas. So that's the interesting thing, how we can think about the EU's open strategic autonomy, of course, the United States reshoring of supply chains, technological decoupling, China's Made in 2025 strategy I already mentioned. These are all sort of testify to this new dynamic whereby major powers start to balance their dependence on each other, which easily also then creates a tit-for-tat and tug-of-war sort of economic security dilemma, not unlike the traditional security dilemmas that we've studied for since Thucydides or something. Ashley has written a book on part of this dynamic, of course, of balancing in economic terms. So one should consult Ashley's book there as well. I think it's open access. And you're continuing your research on this as well, of course. And also on the sort of economic balancing internally, not only externally. The second concept that we use here and try to develop in our chapter is the concept of corporate geoeconomics. So by which we really refer to the reactions by companies to the increased state intervention and the attempts by states to balance their economic dependencies and enlist companies for this purpose, for their geoeconomic statecraft. So this collides to sometimes it converges, as we discussed this morning, sometimes it converges, sometimes it collides with state interests. So the state and the business interest sometimes converge, sometimes collides. Before, business actors were given a free rein under sort of neoliberal globalization to decide who they trade with and where they produce and so on and forth. And the state was kept at arm's length. This is no longer the case. Many of these companies are, however, quite powerful non-state actors who see their autonomy, their own autonomy now also challenged by this increased state intervention and by state attempting to enlist them for their own strategies. Some of them will push back against the state, as we discussed a bit this morning already. Some will push back and have power to push back against these new geoeconomic policies. Some have great lobbying power to do that. Others will try to adapt to this new environment and make use of the situation, actually, through gaining a competitive edge through subsidies. And some may try to play on both sides. And we really, in this chapter with Enrique, we recognize three main strategies of corporate geoeconomics. The first is it's sort of business as usual. We can think of German car makers, perhaps, very heavily exposed to the Chinese market. They wouldn't like to see any politicization of these economic relations now with China and try to, let's just continue as usual. Let's not politicize. Let's not decouple or de-risk even, right? So they want to continue with their business on the Chinese market. Understandable, of course. You have the second strategy, sort of one company, two systems, trying to play on both sides. We referred already to Tesla this morning with trying to, despite what all the US government tries to do, still opens up a factory in China no matter what. Mind you, there are complicating factors with such a strategy. You may end up in a pretty image-wise in a difficult situation when it comes to human rights, for instance. There might be a difficult human rights situations in some parts of China that sort of goes into that supply chains when you produce your cars there, and that might come back to haunt you a bit. There are other such of course sanctions, secondary sanctions, all that. So it's not entirely problematic for you to play on both sides, of course. Third strategy, we call it here patriotic capitalism. It might not be so patriotic actually at all. I mean, this is when you sort of, it might be patriotic, but it might be state capture actually. When you try to capture the state and get all the subsidies from there and outdo your competitors because you get all that help from the state. You might claim that your sector is of such a strategic nature that the state ought to get in and help us out here. It's so important for national security. So here, governments and businesses might actually side together under sort of a new geoeconomic strategy. We can think of the US semiconductor industry in 1920, starting to lobby, advocating for state measures such as tax breaks, investments in this industry because of national security interests. Well, they have been indeed extremely successful, let's say. The package is quite huge to help out the US semiconductor industry. And this sort of stance has been echoed by Google's former CEO, who was advocating large subsidy packages in order for the US to be able to compete geopolitically with China. And so to be sure, companies are not relinquishing the pursuit of profits here. Rather, they're seeking ways to continue to deliver profits under a much more politicized environment. So that brings me to my last slide of our chapter. So geoeconomics as a multi-level game. Imogen was already referring to it a bit here. So there are sort of three levels of this geoeconomic game here. The first level is where the state adopts measures to balance dependence on each other, on other states, which might feed this chain reaction and economic security dilemma. They balance their dependencies particularly on those considered unreliable from a security perspective. The US-China dynamic right now speaks a lot to this dynamic, of course. And at another level, the states seek to influence the behavior of their national businesses in order to implement some of the measures aimed at balancing their dependencies. So US government's measures to discourage American companies from increasing their exposure to China. We see this in Europe as well now, talking up the China risk, discouraging European companies from investing in China. That's a sort of second level of this dynamic. There's a third level as well, when states seek to influence foreign firms in order to either exclude foreign companies from their own economies and from accessing strategic capabilities. Think of high tech. Or to attract them so as to contribute to the buildup of these strategic capabilities. So Huawei, TikTok has of course been excluded from the US, from the American market, whereas IRA tries to attract green tech companies to set up shop in the US and so contribute to the build-up of strategic capabilities in the US. And China is of course doing the same, trying to attract strategic capabilities in technology, for instance, that they don't have it themselves, an electric car maker like Tesla. And indeed, at this level, the interests of states and foreign companies may converge or diverge. So this is not only about state-state, it's about state playing with its own companies or with other companies as well. And other companies might want to make an inroad somewhere. This was all. I'll stop here to give us a good time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Mikael, for that. And now, at this point, I will go into loop into our discussant, as it were, to ask questions and comment on the presentations by the three editors and Mikael.
Excellent. Is it okay if I sit?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
So first, and I can't see your co-presenters on the screen, but I do want to thank. Here you are. Thank you for this wonderful book. I do believe it makes a very powerful and critical contribution to an area that, as we're all keenly aware, has until recently been pretty under-theorized. Academics in general, but especially the academic discourse in the space has been hesitant to use the G word and to tackle geoeconomics head on. And there are, of course, reasons for this hesitancy that are rooted in the reality of how our own field works, because no matter how long a shadow we may individually cast on the history of geoeconomic patterns or behavior or the tools of actions as a fundamental component of global affairs, or how we might each individually conceptualize or understand what exactly it is now that has fundamentally changed or is changing. There's no denying that when Luttwak coined the term, it was at a historical inflection point that went in a very different direction than he expected, albeit temporarily, but it went in a different direction. So while the 70s and 80s really saw this healthy discourse on the potential for competition and coercion in the context of complex interdependence, the overwhelming discourse soon after Luttwak wrote in academia in the late 90s and early aughts, at least in the US, was very heavily focused on the power and potential of globalization and the benefits of integration, and there was very little analytical space to discuss its potential limits. So now as the pendulum shifts back, once again, we have a political and a corporate audience, I think, that are very hungry for analytical tools to navigate this space. But we also have academics, I think, from a variety of discipline that are hungry to revisit the geoeconomics concept and shape the lexicon in a way that does create space for open discussion about what geoeconomics actually means. and what are the different angles that we can use and the perspectives and lenses that might help us understand this. And I think that's where the beauty and genius of this volume really comes in, right? Because the first thing you realize as you read it is that it provides this space for contestation. You know, the authors don't define or delineate how we must understand geoeconomics, but instead create that space for argumentation about its meaning, its limits, and its possibilities. And by identifying some key but not exhaustive themes for extension of the study of geoeconomics beyond conflict, beyond the state, beyond security, they are really opening that playing field for what I hope is going to be a fruitful and rich field that will hopefully avoid the monolithic-ism approach entirely. We can all pray for that. The second important thing that I think this volume brings to the field is the recognition of and a focus on the importance of the EU as a key geoeconomic actor in the context of great power competition. But what I particularly like about this volume is that it includes authors who recognize and problematize the constraints that the EU faces as an actor in this space. So as an economic powerhouse that doesn't have a common foreign policy, doesn't have a unitary military, doesn't have that full range of economic policy tools available to it to act efficiently and coherently in the way that the EU Commission might want. So whether it's at that granular level of foreign investment screening, and countries ignoring the EU's suggestion on whether or not to block certain deals, or whether it's at that broadest level of a common future approach to competition against certain potential countries. So with that praise in mind, I wanted to highlight kind of 4 challenges I see for the future ahead in this space. Not just for what we might lovingly call this Unitarian approach to geoeconomics and the focus on Europe, but also some questions for the authors that I think stem from these kind of 4 big challenges. So the first is that the volume, at least on the surface, and I know that there are many different approaches within it, really does appear to largely accept that the US is in a new Cold War with China. And I would suggest that maybe in that next iteration or maybe in some further articles, problematizing that, framing a little more clearly. Because I think one of the things that's so very interesting about the potential for not just geopolitical, but also geoeconomic competition with China, between the China and the US, is not just the interdependence of their economies or the geoeconomic competition there, but the many ways that they're codependent and how that shapes future action. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I think this is a much more contested concept in the States, actually, than it is in Europe, that we're in a Cold War. The other, and the kind of flip side of that very coin, and I hope Mark Twain forgives me, and I say this as somebody who loves talking about balancing in the economic space, but I think the reports of the death of great power hot war may have been greatly exaggerated. And so, another fundamental difference with the way at least Americans think about the Cold War of the last century is the possibility that things could get much warmer in an unintended way in places like the South China Sea, which I think none of us want to see that happen. So what's truly kind of fascinating is that China and the West can occupy this highly competitive geoeconomic space, a fairly adversarial geopolitical security sphere, but also have many spaces for cooperation in a variety of other social spheres, in the environmental sphere, and in a number of spaces. So I think it's important to problematize that and also to kind of avoid a narrow mindset that could create new Cold War identities and discourses that none of us particularly want to see and aren't necessarily given. The second kind of challenge, I think, in an interesting way, is Russia, right? Because one of the most striking lessons that came, or that has come from the war, is that weaponizing interdependence through the use of things like SWIFT sanctions can be a one-and-done weapon, right? And it can also force changes that lead to unintended economic counterbalancing alliances by the very actors that you're seeking to influence. You know, kind of Russia and China quickly have been cooperating on the payment clearing space to come around sanctions, but also that sanctions haven't been as effective or as painful as we expected. And that's something that we as theorists need to really try to understand. So my question for the authors there is how has the war in Ukraine changed your thinking potentially about how we understand geoeconomics since this issue was written? So that's the first big question. The third kind of interesting point I wanted to raise for Mikael on balancing dependencies, you know, I think it's a really useful and fruitful framework in certain circumstances, especially for understanding when interdependence is potentially being weaponized, especially how investment screening measures might be used to balance dependencies. And I know this comes from my own work on internal balancing in the investment screening phase, but also from David Baldwin's work on economic internal balancing and others in IR theory who really see some of these behaviors as broader, right? Because investment screening actions and the actual behavior of states has focused recently on supply chain issues, but historically and concurrently also focus on some other big challenges that aren't just about balancing adversaries, but also about balancing potential national security threats or even power balances within our own alliances. And that it might be helpful to kind of broaden our understanding of that. So my question for you is, how can we account for geoeconomic competition among allies? This is a question that's really framed my work, but I really wonder how we, you know, for you, how we can apply this balancing of dependencies to allied relationships as well as we might in other spaces. And then my last and broadest question for all of the authors is, where does the global South fit in to this entire framework? Where does Japan fit in? Where does Australia fit in? I think it's, you know, there's a very potentially pivotal role for certain countries like India. And how do we understand them in some of the frameworks that are presented in this book? So, but I love the book. So those are questions asked with great curiosity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. That's wonderful. So I think without further ado, I will hand over the floor to the three editors.
Can I? Yes, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say maybe can each of us answer one question? I think that would be easiest, right? So
Okay. I mean, you can pick. So you can either, you know, address one of these four different questions. So we're talking about the, you know, the aspect of a U.S.-China Cold War, whether you would like to problematize that, whether you would like to factor in sort of a more of a codependence nature of the relationship, and also the possibility of a slippery slope towards hot war, and sort of contextualize that approach of a Cold War with the template, which was the real Cold War, the Cold War I, whatever you want to call it. You want to have a go at that?
Yeah. So maybe Adam can say something because
I have to in a few minutes jump on to another call, but I'll try to jump back on to this. But just to thank Mikael and Jens for organizing this book launch, and in particular to Ashley for her very kind words. It's always nice when you start a project and you finish it and you think, well, I hope this is good. And then you send it out in the world and then people say, hey, this is actually really good. So it makes it all very it was definitely worthwhile to do that. And I hope we are increasing the debates on what is geoeconomic. I just wanted to kind of reflect across the questions, perhaps not all of them. I agree with what Ashley said about how the degree of interdependence is significant, right? Any discussion of decoupling that we've seen is once you start looking at the numbers, you think, well, yeah, it's great. We can rejig some supply chains in a certain way, but we're still pretty much tied with China. And yeah, I mean, if something happens in Taiwan, then all bets are off. But I think interaction will be fairly intense going forward. But I think, and the lesson for me at least on the Russia invasion of Ukraine and what we're seeing in the workaround and the position of the global South as well is, I mean, ultimately, I think what's at stake for us, and this is why it's thinking about a Cold War frame, is that, liberalism matters. And if we want to live in a free society, I think we need to emphasize that. And, I have the immense privilege right now. I'm sitting in Adam Smith's last and remaining home. And I'm mentioning this because there's Adam behind me, and he's buried about 100 meters away from me.
Oh, God.
But it's true. No, but the thing is, and he died in this very home. And in the room I'm sitting in, he had dinners with other luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment they were radical liberals, right? I mean, and I think, and they're not all anti-statist, you don't have to kind of have a libertarian view, but, in the world we live in, liberalism matters. And I think it matters for creativity and prosperity ultimately, right? It's great that we have, there's state-driven economies and that can do a lot. I mean, I think will depend particularly on China for the green transition and clean tech. That is clear. But I think there's still something more fundamental where we in the quote-unquote West need to defend liberalism. And it matters, I think, also for the global South. There are too many countries in the global South that think, do we need democracy? Do we need to have freedom of speech? Do we need all these things that we take for granted, and even I think that are under attack in the West that is unfortunate. So for me, I take it at a broader view that there is something at stake. It might not go to the level of a clash of civilizations, yet liberalism is important, and we need to defend our values, and we need to make that clear, even in the context of cooperation and collaboration with the likes of China. So I got to jump on another call, but I'm going to come back in 15 minutes, hopefully to the same room. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adam. We're looking forward to having you back. And I'm just thinking that maybe this is a topic that could be picked up on. Do we want to re-envisage a geo-economic liberalism? It sounds like an oxymoron, right? But maybe there is something to be conceptualized around that. But I will hand back now to the remaining editors to take a bite at these 4 comments of Ashley's. So who wants to go first? US-China Cold War, that type of frame.
Imogen,
do you want to problematize that, or yeah?
Maybe Imogen, do you want to go? You're muted.
Yeah, I mean, I have, for sure, I think, just echoing Adam's point about interdependence, but a general point I kind of want to make about the volume is that, what we want to do is lay out an analytical approach. And as Milan said, this is a modus operandi. And one thing that is definitely stressed in the volume, and I think opens up a promising research agenda, is to think of geoeconomics as diversity, right? And that's something we stress in our conceptual approach, is the diversity of instruments, of actors, and interests. So I think even though US-China Cold War is definitely a part of, backdrops a lot of the empirical material that's presented in the book, it's by, far and away not the, let's say, the core framing. And it's precisely this interdependence, not only between state interests, but also between state and private finance and private interests, that we want to highlight. So the other point I want to make was about sort of the role of the global South. I think this is, a this huge potential to explore the interlinkages and the implications, like as we're seeing with the competition over infrastructure development, whether it's BRI, Global Gateway from the EU, or the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. I mean, there is a territorial logic that underpins this, that kind of echoes the sort of fight for territory with the first Cold War. But one thing that is complicating this narrative is that a lot of this infrastructure investment, even though a lot of it is state-driven, I mean, we also have this other narrative around the role of private finance in co-constituting a lot of those infrastructure initiatives. And I think that's an interesting question: is what role do private interests, what role does private finance play in these sort of this fight for territory in the global south? Are we seeing, is there potential for an instrumentalization of this state security narrative by private finance? What room is there for global south to balance between these interests? Is a really interesting avenue for research, and definitely needs to be taken into account. I think that raises an important point about the global south and third countries and great power conflict. How is a potential non-aligned movement going to materialize in this sort of more interconnected intertwining of private and state interests? And this is, I think, where geoeconomics and our attempt to conceptualize geoeconomics can be particularly useful, is that, again, it's a modus operandi and an analytical approach. So I'll just end my notes there.
Imogen, and I know that also that you're taking with you this analytical lens, or sort of what you got out of this work also in your future research that you're carrying out. So I'll invite you in a bit to, maybe just inform our audience what that's going to be about. I think we're all curious to hear. Maybe before turning to Mila, maybe, or Imogen, whoever of you two want to take a crack at the question about Russia and the change of basically how the Ukraine situation kind of changed the possible exhaustion of geoeconomic arsenals, or the reaction to sanctions, and that whole question part of Ashley's comment and question. Maybe I'll first turn to you, Mikael, regarding balancing of dependencies, and see how do you envision, if I now paraphrase your question correctly, the sort of this balancing and geoeconomic competition in the context of competition among allies and different ally structures like the European Union.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, for those great comments. And I will start by taking up your third comment, and then I'll come back to the question of balance, because they're sort of connected in my mind a bit. So you mentioned the fact that geoeconomic coercion can actually lead to cohesiveness on the other side. So when we start to sanction Russia heavily, Russia becomes a sort of a vassal of China. That's an unintended outcome, that Russia and China might find each other and strengthen their partnership against us because of our geoeconomic coercion. Because we put so much sanctions on Russia, we kind of drive Russia into the hands of China. So that's the problem. That's a problem with geoeconomic coercion. But geoeconomic coercion is not the only geoeconomic strategy. We can think of, and I love to speak about geoeconomic coercion, binding, wedging, and hedging. And my colleagues have heard me speaking about those strategies quite for many times. But we can envisage other type of geoeconomic action towards China and Russia that are not centered coercion, which is a very blunt instrument, right? We could imagine geoeconomic binding to some extent. Send Richard Nixon to Beijing, you can offer carrots to China in order to try to bind up China to us instead, and at the same time you drive a wedge between Russia and China. We're not seeing that happening, of course, because if U.S. Democrats and Republicans are of the same opinion of one thing, that's about containing China. So we won't see Richard Nixon traveling now to Beijing, I suppose, or any other U.S. president. So binding is one thing that you can do, and it's a very different strategy from Kherson. That's about carrots, and you try to bind up other countries. That also speaks to the question about global South, what to do about that. I think there will be this very much geoeconomic binding attempt to bind other countries. China has been doing that for 20, 30 years already through investments and loans and whatnot. The BRI has been binding up other countries to itself. The US and Europe has forgotten about that to some extent, that we need to perhaps to start to focus on that more. And there are wedge strategies when you try to drive a wedge. Give carrots to some, give stick to others, and their common line will fall down. The geoeconomics is can be a very effective wedge strategy. Russia used that in energy policy for quite a while in Europe, driving this wedge in Europe, and our common line fell down. The last one is hedging, and that brings me back to your question on balancing. So there are things happening in geoeconomics which does not return to balancing only. So if we think about, you asked about the question of geoeconomic competition among allies. Right? How would that look like? Where I would think it looks a bit like hedging, in a way that if we think about the U.S., the transatlantic relationship right now, U.S., Euro, EU. In Europe, there are those that are advocating a hedging strategy, basically, because we don't want to become too dependent on U.S. So they speak about more strategic autonomy, that sort of more self-sufficiency in Europe, and so on. But the other equation of that is, of course, you can also integrate with the US more in certain areas. Where we will end up is probably somewhere in between, right? So we're hedging between the self-sufficiency strategies and the integration strategy. In some areas we will cooperate and come together and integrate much more. In other areas we will not. That's not the sort of hard core of a balancing strategy against the US, but it's something that is sort of a mixture of balancing and bandwagoning. You end up somewhere in between. So that's probably, and I'm definitely not saying that sort of our concept of balancing would capture everything. It doesn't capture everything that goes on in military, sort of in traditional geopolitics either. There are also sort of different levels of sort of things that you don't capture with the balancing concept and the cooperative aspect of that. Having said that, the rise of geoeconomics and a sort of geoeconomic world order, I do see as much more conflictual than where we come from. So there will be more conflict, there will be more competition. I think that's the hard truth that we will need to live. But it doesn't, there will be, of course, cooperation as well. The G7, I think, but that cooperation will happen in slightly different forms, perhaps, than until now. So the WTO, I don't really see as a very effective organization anymore, and in this new world order that we're moving into, I find it hard to fathom how it would come back to become an effective economic governance organization. So I suspect we'll see more of organizations which are not as multilateral as the WTO. We will have cooperation going on in sort of minilateral forums or other forums like the G7 or new forums coming up as well. But they will not be as global, I think, as until now.
So let me also tell the audience, both online and in the room, that please feel free to come up with your questions at this time. I think we will invite questions from the audience as well. And while you consider those questions, let me add a little comment and and a question as well, both to Mikael and to the others also. Ashley, I'd like to also hear from you on this. So when I hear, when we discuss now Russia and the kind of over-reliance or tendency to jump at coercion as the principle or the first means of geoeconomic strategy, and also the unwillingness to apply coercion in the context of allies, I have a few comments of my own. I sort of thought when you said that one of the way where we are right now, if we can call it geoeconomic diplomacy, is really ham-fisted and blunt, in the sense that we do rely on these instruments that will eventually, the effectiveness of which will eventually be exhausted the further we push. And so if we go back to Cold War I, there are at least two very important differences that strike me. And the first is the lack of a nimble geoeconomic diplomacy, a multifaceted, there are tendencies, but it's not applied as nimbly as it was back then. And the other thing is there's a lack of a coherent positive narrative, right, coming from, particularly from the West. There's nothing like those, well, partly probably because the old narrative is felt to be a bit discredited at this point, but there's nothing else that can sort of be exported as a happy, hopeful message. And I think that's also huge difference between now and then. In terms of coercion within allies, one could also think, I also think that the number of instruments applied even among allies is actually also includes coercion. We can think of the Helms-Burton Act, and we can think of the EU blocking statute. And sometimes it can be quite sort of coercive, even in Europe. And there is also I mean, at least in recent times, and we've talked about Luttwak so many times, but during the days of Luttwak, we had the TRIPS agreement for intellectual property, opening up the possibility of inducing trading partners to do business with the United States, because obviously the United States is the intellectual property powerhouse, still is, and certainly was at those days. So the TRIPS agreement, I think, is sort of similar to the Marshall Plan in that sense. It creates an inducement gravitational field, and even you might even say the whole WTO agreement should be kind of recast as a sort of inducement package. Maybe it doesn't serve that function anymore, but at least I think originally it was like that. So with that, I don't think we have any additional comments online. Do we have anything in the room? Or otherwise, I see a hand back there. I think I saw that hand back there.
It's me.
Yeah.
Cordelia Buchanan Ponchek at Sphere. My question, I'm going to sit back down if that's okay. Quick comment and then a question to Imogen. The quick comment, we're talking about the impact of sanctions on Russia. There's a great piece that's just out by Boren et al. In International Economics that uses a general equilibrium trade model to look at the welfare cost of sanctions and find that there's, I think, a 4.8% welfare cost to Russians with very little welfare cost to the EU. So I guess the comment is, when we're thinking about decoupling, the impact on citizens, which may or may not be able to influence their government, but how we can separate this impact on citizens from impact on government and assess the effectiveness that way. But Imogen, on infrastructure, you mentioned private-public partnerships, and you talked about a couple different programs, but I did not hear the Blue Dot Network program mentioned, which is, of course, a consortium of Japan, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, Spain, and so I think I wanted to hear whether you think that would be effective and that it's integrating the Global South and, of course, partners in the Indo-Pacific. But then also, if not public-private partnerships when it comes to infrastructure, then what? What's the next avenue for that? Thank you.
Yeah, Imogen, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. Yeah, I mean, Blue Dot Consortium, Japan, US, UK. I think this is Blue Dot is intimately tied with the recent G7 initiative. Where is it? The Global Infrastructure and Investment. One moment, let me pull up my slides. Yeah, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. So on PPPs, I suppose the perspective I'm coming from is to problematize kind of the dependence between sort of the need to draw in private capital in order to realize these infrastructure developments in the global south, and the fact that states have had to, let's say, to de-risk the participation of private finance. And I think what's interesting is because on the one hand, with China and the BRI, we see this is pretty much state-coordinated infrastructure development. But in recent years, we see that this has become an increasingly problematic model with a lot of loans being rolled over, and the question of China's own debt. So how sustainable does this model become on the one hand, and on the other hand, with traditional kind of sort of market-based financing and now the development of PPPs, is that I don't really see this discussion being politicized, geopoliticized in a geoeconomic framing. So, to what extent can private finance instrumentalize a lot of the narratives around infrastructure competition in the global south? So I think there's, a potential question around the power of private finance there. But on the other hand, does this in fact present an opportunity for third countries, for developing states to hedge not only between different state interests, but also private finance? And that's, I think, an interesting avenue that needs to be researched because, in recent years, Chinese finance has provided a lot of that, let's say, filled in that policy space. But if we see Chinese finance being rolled back, what role does private finance play through this geoeconomic lens, the geoeconomization of development, let's say? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Imogen, do we have any other questions? We have one over there. Yes, there. Yep. Oh.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. So my question is about multilateralism or the future of multilateralism. So many interventions today, they have mentioned the G7 as having more and more influence, and multilateral institutions such as the WTO as fading in importance. And this is something that's definitely visible also at the IMF. So for example, the Nordic Baltic constituency, even with our very tiny voting power, we have had, or we still have, of course, an equal speaking right at the executive board, which means that even though we don't have very large economies, we still have tangible opportunities to affect to participate and to affect the global policy debate regarding economic policy. But now more and more we are seeing that these important discussions and debates, they move to the G7 tables, and we don't have a seat at a table. We are not even in the same room. So we already talked about the effects on the global south, but we hadn't touched upon the effect on small open economies such as ourselves. So my question would be on the whole panel on what your views are on the future. So where will small open economies stand in this regard? Thanks.
That's a wonderful question. Do we have another? We have another question over there. So we'll remember that for all of the panelists, including our discussant, and we will sample one more question. We may still have another place for another question as well after that. So yeah, Tobias.
Trying to tie in my question a little bit into this. Maybe a bit big question, and hopefully a bit provocative. On this idea of multipolarity, bipolarity? Where are we moving? Basically, my question is the geoeconomic order, Mikael, as you call it, is it going to be a bipolar one or a multipolar one? There seems to be, let me give you my comment, there seems to be sort of an idea that multipolarity is somewhat inevitable, right? There's economic growth in a lot of emerging economies, of course, and so that seems to be the sort of inevitable idea that more and more economies hold power in the global economy and can hence leverage it somehow. However, at the same time, for me, there's clearly also a concentration of power really in the two main powers, China and the United States. They hold, for me, all the keys that you need to really leverage geoeconomic power, which is about technology. Who are really the powers who are competing over emerging technologies? It's really only a handful. There's no India there. They're being tugged into supply chains, but the intellectual property and the know-how seems to me be held quite concentrated. Not as concentrated as during the Cold War, perhaps, right? So there's a certain level of diversification. But I wonder how you see that, whether you think that this is also breaking up if we're actually moving into more multipolarity, or whether we actually see some sort of concentration among the two great powers, because this is, I think, a fundamental question also for Europe, if what we believe the future global economy will look like, if we maybe believe, or what we should sort of bet on, perhaps. Thanks.
Yeah. Do we have any other more? Thank you for that. And a third question right here, and then we will sample answers to those excellent questions.
Hey, thank you. My name is Niina Hyvärinen, and first of all, congratulations for this wonderful book that I'm really looking forward to diving deeper into it. And we actually had, just building on the excellent questions we just had about the role and place for the small countries and whether we are entering into a bipolar or multipolar world. Now that you've had also discussions with the policymakers, and now that we are entering into the election phases, like both in US, in Europe, we have elections coming, how well do the policymakers actually understand this environment and this context and this whole concept of geoeconomics? Because I haven't really seen it in the policy frameworks being discussed, but more by scholars and researchers. So what's your take on the understanding of the policymakers of the world that we are navigating in? Thank you.
Brilliant question. I think what we'll do is we'll start with Ashley, then Mikael, and then Imogen and Mila.
This is tough because there's so many things that I want to say. To go first to the multilateralism question, I mean, again, I think I'm a little more optimistic about the role of international organizations in the future, though it is clear that at the moment, especially in this particular security space, there are a lot of conversations that are happening at the G7, right? But I think a lot more are also going to be happening in NATO, which obviously, Finland will have a strong role in. I think there is also we will likely see this resurgent idea of a summit of democracies or a D10, or that idea hasn't gone away, and I think it's going to return, and we're going to see it as we try to navigate this space of how do we deal with some of these multilaterals where we aren't able to have the conversations that we want to have and promote liberalism in the way that Adam mentioned. So that will be an interesting space. On policymakers and how they understand this new technology, I mean, that is the biggest learning curve, I think, for every country in the world at the moment, right? And the biggest challenge for policymakers and their staff. I know we had some staff members here as well, and I do talk to policymakers all the time, and this is crucial, right? It's really crucial, and it's key to a variety of issues. I mean, you mentioned TikTok earlier, right? I mean, we haven't banned TikTok yet, unless I missed some major news this morning. But what the U.S. did do, right, and it has become very clear, is that they asked, banned on government devices, yeah, but asked through CFIUS, right, and Biden's made the public request to divest TikTok's assets in the U.S. And, this actually comes not back to an audience question, but to your comment on corporate geoeconomics. What are the limits of corporate geoeconomics? I mean, if you saw the head of TikTok in the U.S. give his statements in Congress, he would love to divest, right? I mean, like that would be his dream, I'm sure, if he could, for his company, if it was a true market actor. But he's not going to be allowed to by China. That's been made very clear. So a full ban may have to happen. So there are some limits that we see in the corporate geoeconomic space. On also on the financing and private financing and public-private partnerships, one of the other kind of limits that we do see in this space as well is really something that we can't necessarily fully control, even though we always think we can, but is inflation, right? Because the current market has really affected the way that market actors are able to act in the corporate economic space. Tobias, my previous panelist, and I were sitting this morning next to a woman at breakfast who was at the Antarctic Council this morning, talking about that very issue, about the lack of private capital available for infrastructure investment in the Arctic and Antarctic because of inflation and how difficult that is to overcome. So I think we've got a lot of challenges. We've got the explaining technology to policymakers. We've got some of those real true state limits, and then how to overcome this issue with multilaterals. The one last thing I would say on the role of small open economies is there are some great innovators out there, right? And across the EU and also the UK. I mean, if we look at things like quantum computing, things which, the European framework programs are spending a lot of money on, UK is spending a lot of money on, that could be game changers for the geoeconomic power of some of these countries. So I don't think we are necessarily stuck in a bipolar system when it comes to technological leadership. We might still be in the security space, but in the economic space and the technology space, I think there's a lot of movement that's about to happen.
I think it's fascinating, the question about bipolarity, multipolarity. I would add pluripolarity if we think that corporations can actually become so strong actors that they will have a say there as well. We would add pluripolarity there. I think there are two conflicting trends when we think about that question. The first is, in the data-driven economy that we're now in, the economies of scale are huge. So the data-driven economy that we're moving into, the digitalization of the global economy, favors big actors. So that would speak for, would it speak for a bipolar, unipolar, bipolar, or a pluripolar order? It depends. But I definitely think that there are huge economies of scale. The small actors are in trouble here. The more data you can mass, the more people will come to you. There are lots of different arguments that I can't open up here on the economies of scale of the data-driven economy. Right? That's one. The second trend is, our concept of balancing. When somebody becomes very, very strong, others will start to balance against that. So that speaks against hegemony. It might also speak actually against bipolarity, because balancing might happen not only against the US, or it might also start to happen against China. India will probably balance against China as much as it can as well, by hedging, by creating alternative institution, by creating, and by the way, the Cold War wasn't a bipolar order in my sense. I think it was multipolar or already. You had the whole non-aligned movement, and they had a lot of power as well. It wasn't so. It's not entirely clear that it was completely a bipolar, but this is very controversial. I know we can discuss a whole night about it if you like. So the question is, I don't know where we end up, but I certainly know that there are two strong trends, and they pull in different directions a bit.
Thank you for that, Mikael. So I will give the floor, the chance to sort of close this to our three editors, and Adam is back. So for Adam's benefit, there are basically three types of questions that we're dealing with here from the audience. One is, what about small open economies? The second is, are we heading towards a multipolar or bipolar world? And thirdly, how much are policymakers on top of what's going on and what we have been talking about here? Your penny's worth on either of those or all of those. Closing remarks.
Yeah, I apologize for having to jump to another meeting, and now I'm back, and so I missed all the exciting conversation. I apologize for that. Just to touch on, I think that was Mikael that said, I mean, he was right that the Cold War was multipolar. Even today, we see that we still have that multipolarity. Notwithstanding, I think it's what's the substance of those outside of the duality, if you like. I think small open economies that do well are ones that have a notion of a commitment to liberalism. I know there's some like Singapore that are kind of halfway in between, but then I think the benefit is being connected with a liberal international order and a commitment to liberalism. And that's just to reiterate my other points. And I just say that because I think increasingly it's something that we need to stress, that it's we have a choice, and corporations, if they, particularly Western ones now that talk a good game about ESG and caring about society, it's like, well, okay, well, what about the liberal assumptions on that, right? What does that mean? How are you going to defend liberalism and political liberalism in particular in a world that's increasingly fractious? Whether policymakers are on top of what's going on, I mean, I think it depends on, that's contingent on where you are and what sector you're in. There's definitely a lot of work for think tanks and universities to educate, but that's why I think events like this have been are useful. And so thanks to the organizers for bringing us along.
Thank you, Adam Dixon, Imogen Liu, Milan Babic, Ashley Lenihan, and my colleague Mikael Wigel. That basically wraps up this session. But before you leave, let me remind you that this is an ongoing research project, and that we are now launching, and maybe we could display that. We're now launching a new work stream. Could you click on that link? Is that possible, so that we can open that up? A new publication series, which is called the Springer. Is it possible to open it? Springer Studies in Law and Geoeconomics, which is a new book series devoted to exploring and contest and engage with the legal economic nexus in an age of geoeconomic statecraft. The idea is to publish books, edited volumes, monographs, longer or shorter, on themes where law and geoeconomics integrate, and to try to get the epistemic communities to merge and talk the same language. So we will publish our first book this summer, and a couple of more volumes are coming out. So if you follow that link there, you will come to the page where you can read more about that book series, and also engage with us and submit paper proposals or book proposals for publication and consideration. So thank you so much. I hand back to Mikael to say a few final words, or
I think
I
think you wrapped it up very nicely. So that's I'm really happy for this. I think we had a great discussion. I'm really happy for all the participation that we also had both in here and online. There were a lot of people following this discussion, and I think so. This is engaging people, and that's a good sign for our future endeavors, of course, as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.